Hello, and welcome to another Progressives for Immigration Reform podcast. I am your host, Kevin Lynn, and today I'm joined by John McKeown, and we're going to talk about the environment and population. Now, John lives in England. In fact, he lives in West Cornwall, England. John is a retired academic. He worked at university starting in 1994, first in software development, and then teaching undergraduates for 10 years at places such as Gloucestershire University, and he currently works IT support at a local university. John has also worked for a faith-based nonprofit environmental organization and is deeply concerned with the environment and in particular the role population growth plays in the degradation of the ecological systems that we human beings rely on for our very survival. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here. Now, John, what prompted this podcast today was something that you wrote on a comment that you posted to a website, and the website is called one moment, I'll bring it up here in just a second. The Overpopulation Project. And I'm going to actually share our screen because I want everyone to see.
Okay, that's the review of the book.
Right, you reviewed a book called Empty Planet. And your review I thought was really interesting because in the book, they tend to look at population decline as a bad thing, as opposed to something that we should be welcoming. And
yeah, they see it as a problem they see it as a problem for economic growth and to some extent for the geopolitics.
Yes, absolutely. And your comment was, Empty Planet, the shock of global population decline, claims that life on Earth is stressed but coping with the present level of human impact. Global population will peak in 2050. Subsequent population decline will alleviate ecological problems, and countries with populations that are only slowly growing should act now to boost their populations. Part one of this review argued that the point is misleading since a peak in 2050, while desirable, would require rapid changes in policy and culture to promote a small, quote unquote, ideal family size in countries which have high birth rates. Part two will explore the book's other claims and suggest that even if population peak does arrive early, their natural growth boosting advice would still be unhelpful. John, wow, I couldn't agree with you more in your summation of that, but it always happens. Recently, I was at a conference and an economist, author of several books, well known to the American public, had mentioned the demographic cliff, that our population, since it's in decline, how are we possibly going to pay for our pensions of everyone who's retiring? We actually need to increase the amount of immigration. Currently, America, in the United States, about 1.2 million people are issued new green cards every year. So he's looking to increase that number. And it was great, really refreshing to see your review of the book and see that someone like yourself holds very similar views as I do with regard to the perils of population growth.
Okay, yeah. I can comment on The Economist.
Oh, absolutely.
Like. Yeah. I mean, the first thing I'm going to say might sound a bit cynical, but that's because my fun reading at the moment has been Dan Lyon's Disrupted: Misadventures in the Tech Startup World. So I think the Economist could be right in a way, in the sense that if a business or a sector of an economy relies to get the level of profitability that venture capitalists are demanding of it, if it relies on being able to replace well-paid, secure contracts, securely employed staff with low-paid, precarious staff, then I think the Economist is correct. That particular business model does need continuous population growth.
Like
to undermine labour.
Packaged good industry, a Nestle or a Hershey, people that rely on a lot of customers to make smaller purchases.
Yeah, I mean, they need to be able to undermine, to change the balance of power between employers and workers. So I can understand where he's coming from. I mean, I don't agree that, I don't really understand what he means by a demographic cliff for the US population. That doesn't make any sense to me. I've got a couple of slides. If I could share my screen.
Oh, absolutely. If you have any trouble, I'll see what I can do to help out.
I think it'll be okay. Has it reached you?
I don't see it yet.
Oh, sorry, Dad. Yeah. Okay.
Oh,
so
there
if
it
I go
is.
Forward. I have to go on to the next one. Now, okay, I think I'll comment first on, because I think that Economist you mentioned before we were on air, that he was saying who's going to pay for the retirement pensions.
Correct.
If we don't have a
But that
growing
was the overall
population.
concern. We'll have a declining population,
Yeah.
less taxes being, less Social Security being taken in, and being able to provide for that group of people.
Yeah, I mean, there was a recent article by Adair Turner in praise of population decline. I don't know if you saw that.
No, I haven't.
But Adair Turner was the chair of the UK government pensions commission. So he's the top guy for pensions in the UK, and he's fine with it. I mean, he's actually, as I'll perhaps come to later, that he's saying there are benefits from population decline, but he certainly understands the pensions implications, and he didn't see that as a problem. And that is a specialist area of economics, so I don't know, the Economist who was talking might not have been. I think a part of it is, I think where the Economist is coming from is the idea that moderate population growth is okay and good as long as the economic growth is significantly faster. I think that's the kind of idea. So when there were, in the mid-20th century, rates of growth that were higher than economists liked, like I think sort of in the late 60s, late 1960s, 2.7% in China and 3.2% in Uganda, numbers like that, they didn't like it. But when, I mean, by 1990, the population growth rates were still around above 2%, but by the end of the first decade of this century, the less developed regions, as they're called, were down to 1.37% growth. So they think that's okay. They think population growth 1% is fine because they have an idea that you can have continuous economic growth of more than that. So it keeps ahead. So they're just looking at two rates, and as long as one's rising faster than the other, they're not worried. As far as they're concerned, they can just keep on rising forever. There's no idea of a limit to growth, no ecology.
Is that because they're really blind to the fact that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet?
Yes, you're right. Yes, it's not part of. That's right. For most economists, that's not part of. They don't do ecology, and it's not part of their training. The biophysical limits are just not something that comes into. I mean, there are ecological economists who do that, but the one you were meeting, probably that kind. I think you had a comment about people fearing population decline.
Right. They look at it as something bad, not to be looked forward to. I mean,
yeah. So my comment on that is there's a long history of that, a long history of the fear of population decline. There's a trilogy of books about it by Jay Winter and Michael Teitelbaum. But historically, that was mostly about military power. It's like, one king saying to another king, my country's population, or more importantly, my army is bigger than your army. And a good example is France after the after defeat in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. For decades after, right up to the 1930s, there were people in France writing about fear of population decline. But the issue was, and this is very similar to the situation in the USA, because the USA has a rapidly growing population. Oh, that changed.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Why don't you go ahead and pop that one up again?
Have we still got the screen share? It doesn't matter at the moment.
Yeah, go ahead and hit that again.
Okay. Yeah, just like the USA has got a rapidly growing population right now, has got natural increase right now. There's a lot more births than deaths in the USA right now.
Yeah, but a lot of our growth is immigration driven. There are some states like California, when you look at in-migration, out-migration, deaths, it's almost 100% is attributed to immigrants and children of immigrants.
Yeah, that's part of it. But there is also still natural increase. I mean, if you look back at the history of the US, most of that is natural increase.
Right.
But so France, in the end of the century, last century, the population was growing, but they were using this language of decline because it's about, for them, comparison with other countries. So it's relative decline. So they feel justified in using the language of decline and cliffs and things because there's no absolute decline, and there's not in the US. It's very unlikely that there'll be absolute decline in population. Well, anytime in the next 100 years.
Right.
But they feel justified in using that language. And I think a modern version, I was talking about military power, which still plays a part, but a modern version is the GDP and comparing countries comparing their national total GDP and who gets to attend the G8 summit and feel important. And I think for those who insist on using GDP, which incidentally is I think a bad measure of well-being, but they could at least track GDP per person, GDP divided by population.
Right, because that would be, we'd be then looking at productivity per worker or effectiveness.
Yeah, or something. Worker. Yes, yeah, that would relate to or it would more relate to the experienced well-being and prosperity of individual people, whereas the national total means nothing except the population's growing. So if the population's growing, it makes the ruler look good, makes it look as if they're doing well, but really only a small elite benefits from that. If the GDP per person is
right, and isn't like an aggregate GDP probably a bad way to look at the health and welfare of a country?
It's a terrible way because this has been well rehearsed in a number of books. But if there's a car crash and an ambulance has to go, if there's disasters, everything that happens adds to GDP. So the GDP is a very poor measure, but it's very hard to dislodge these statistics because people like to be able to compare 10 years ago and 20 years ago, so they like to keep the same statistics. So hopefully that will change. But the other reason, I think, I mean, moving away from the Economist to other people who are made fearful by the media, perhaps, about population not growing fast enough. I think the media highlight the wrong indicators. Are you seeing my screen about the US total fertility rate?
Yes, I have that up now.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, they always talk about the total fertility rate, which is a synthetic measure made up of the age-specific fertility rates for different age groups, and that's been around. They talk about it being below replacement, and it's been around replacement in the USA or below since 1970. Right. So that's 50 years. So I think that the layperson would expect, we've had below replacement fertility, so-called, for 50 years. Shouldn't we be having natural decrease? Or shouldn't there be less births?
In GDP and everything.
Well,
else.
No, in terms of births and deaths.
Okay.
You'd expect, but the reality is, so 50 years of what they call below replacement fertility. And on the next slide. So that this is for a different book. I did a chapter for a book about environmental issues for Christians. And I did the chapter on population for them. And I just wanted to put the actual births and deaths. And there has been, the number of births is substantially more than the number of deaths. Even in it is narrow, the gap is narrowing, but even in 2017, 3.85 million births, 2.81 million deaths. So there's still a substantial increase just from birth being more than deaths. And that's partly because, and in a way that's a paradox, because even, people say, oh, it's because of momentum. And that's true. But, you wouldn't expect momentum to last for 50 years. And so the other reasons are the extension of lifespan. Right. Because you have more people living at the same time, same moment of history, because they're living longer. Now, interesting enough, just over the last few years, life expectancy has been decreasing in the United States. Yeah, well, we've had we've had the same in the UK. I've got a graph somewhere actually, but yeah. So this is a result of the last 50 years of. Yeah, but looking at this now, when you speak to people of faith about, because it does run up against that "be fruitful and multiply" phrase in the Bible. How do you square the need to control population with that? All right. Okay. Well, if you, okay, the virtue of ancient religions is that they bring ancient wisdom to the present day through the traditions that embody them. And that's usually a good thing. But sometimes the ancient wisdom about fertility was in a context of very high infant mortality. Right. And lower life expectancy, correct? Very low life expectancy. And not just infant mortality, but child mortality and young adult, mortality all through the lifespan, and much higher than we have. And also, particularly in ancient Israel, in the highlands where they settled, it was hilly, rocky ground. They needed a lot of labor for clearing, clearing stones and clearing trees, and so it was they could do with as many children as they could get, and they had a particular. This is where the quiver full of sons comes in as well.
Ah, okay.
They particularly want, yeah, it's a quiver full of sons born in a man's youth. So in other words, they're adult sons. And so that's also about them being, being able to, if there were disputes with neighbours, being able to have sort of muscle to stand up to their neighbours and things like that. So, I mean, you know, obviously those Bible verses, they also have spiritual and messianic meanings, but they're built on a foundation of ancient appreciation.
Right, and I guess ultimately, you know, what the idea was to enhance the survivability of that particular group, which is
yeah. I mean, they needed as many children as they could get, really. If you look at the actual, I mean, it's quite hard to get numbers for the population history of ancient Israel, but it seems like it went up and down, and they had a real struggle maintaining their population, even with high fertility.
But today we don't need those kinds of numbers.
No, we don't. No. So it's and to some extent, even the early church didn't take it that way, because obviously the early church, a lot of the leaders of the early church were celibate, and they reinterpreted "be fruitful and multiply." They completely reinterpreted it as spiritual fruitfulness.
Ah, okay.
Be fruitful and multiply virtues, and things like that. There's quite a lot of literature, and they did similar things with the quiver full of sons. So for the early Christians, the highest condition, there was celibacy, but they would also praised even married people who sort of stopped, had stopped reproducing, just voluntary, just went into sort of a celibate state. It's a very different world from now, but it's interesting that that Bible verses can be interpreted in different ways in different times, and it's personally, in the US, when family planning first started in the US, which I think it's in the 19th century. Some of the people pioneering that were the pietists, which is in some ways they're analogous to modern evangelicals, because I read an article about they wanted to have invest more time in children, make sure that their children were raised in biblical principles. So it was about having fewer children of higher spiritual quality. That was a phrase that appears in, that's the title of the article. It comes from a letter by a pietist writer. And
Interesting.
Statistically, the pietists went into that quicker than what the article called the liturgical traditions.
Yeah, and
but they followed on fairly quick.
And perhaps they understood something that only became obvious later, where in a manufacturing, a modern society, fewer children allow you to put more resources into one or two children to allow them to be successful. It becomes easier with a smaller family to make your
that's really true. Successful. And I might say more, but that's because a lot of people think that you have economic development produces smaller families, but you can equally look at it the other way around, the reverse. And say you make, for whatever reason, and the very first country to have fertility, sustained fertility decline was France, just after the French Revolution.
Oh, okay.
So,
interesting.
Oh yeah. And the people who and I watched, there's a popular video online which claims that Britain was the first country to have fertility. It's not true. Britain was about 70 years later, and because it fits in their theory of why fertility decline happens. But actually, it was in France, maybe 1790, and it's maybe related to the French Revolution, you know, it's liberté, fraternité, égalité. Something, an ideological change. I mean, perhaps, because by that stage, the Catholic Church was, did have a sort of pro-natalist attitude, and there was a period when all the Catholic priests left France.
Right.
The revolution.
One way or another.
So it's hard to say exactly, and also there were changes in the inheritance law in France because of the French Revolution, in the way it's divided up among, but anyway, for whatever reason, first they had fertility decline, and before they had, you know, France wasn't urbanized, France wasn't industrialized,
Right.
it didn't have a lot of economic development.
But Napoleon did create a number of public schools, although the Jesuits before probably had been educating more.
They had rising education. That's the one, you're right. That's the thing that they did have. So I think the theories that talk about education are much more convincing than the ones that talk about urbanization and wealth driving it.
Yeah, and quite.
I mean, I think after a while it goes in both directions, and it becomes a virtuous cycle. But
right.
you know, so for modern countries as well, there is and I think this is a very hopeful point, because there are examples. Bangladesh started its fertility decline while it was still very rural, not much economic development. So you can have family planning, voluntary family planning first, and then that enables, you know, if a family has fewer children, like you were saying, they can invest more in each child, and that can lead to development and prosperity, and then it becomes a virtuous cycle. But if you had to wait for them to get rich first and then before they reduce fertility, that's much harder. I mean, that can happen, but it's good to have that option, or that alternative route of fertility decline, family planning first.
You know, it's interesting because we were talking about GDP earlier. When you look at the GDP of early 1950s Brazil and early 1950s Japan, they were pretty similar in terms of size. But Japan, you know, through export-oriented growth and manufacturing, just did amazingly well. It was really a miracle in many respects to rise out of the ashes the way they did. And perhaps, again, small family sizes had something to do with that.
Yeah, it could be. These things are very hard to prove. Demographers find statistical correlations, but the causation is hard to prove. The direction of the cause is hard to prove. Yeah.
But I think one thing that's deniable, and it kind of gets back to your review of the book, where you stated, for instance, you said the world is stressed. And my question to you is, what does that kind of population-driven stress look like today? And what will it look like? Because right now people are saying, you know, for someone to come to the conclusion that we're coping pretty well with our population growth, I have to say, I was in Los Angeles 10 days ago, and it took me an hour and a half to drive 30 miles. And this wasn't during rush hour. It was just after rush hour. And that's population growth. That's more people every year, just, you know, demanding more services, using infrastructure. So what is this? What is the stress?
Okay, I think, I mean, the example I gave, let me see, the example I gave in the book review was, focusing on wildlife, and the Living Planet Index, the half decline in the populations of wildlife species since 1970. So something's wrong if that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I may stick to the wildlife for the moment, the the causes of that are, the two big ones are direct exploitation and habitat loss. Well, perhaps habitat loss. It varies by, I mean, are you seeing this
I
picture
am, with the
yeah?
birds, the mammals, fishes?
Yeah, so it varies by taxonomic group, but the big ones are habitat loss and exploitation. So there was an article, the ravages of guns, nets, and bulldozers. So hunting, fishing, agriculture.
And based on your chart, based on your chart, it's not so much hunting, but it is that loss of habitat. It's urban sprawl. That's the biggest contributor to loss of wildlife.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, this is a global thing. So it's
just recently I was reading in a newspaper, the bird population is down 30 billion worldwide since the 1970s.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not. I don't have that at my fingertips.
Oh, it's 3 billion. I'm sorry, I said 30. I meant 3 billion.
That may well be. The Living Planet one is about the sort of percentage loss in population sizes. And when you have losses, and when you have population shrinking of wildlife species, then there's more risk of extinctions.
Oh, absolutely.
So drives extinctions. But in terms of one of the best sort of big basket things of planetary stress is the planetary boundaries. Sorry, I've typed that wrong. It's the Resilience Centre, Stockholm Resilience Centre. So there's a number of, so the ones that have got the orange things on, so the biosphere integrity is there. They used to call it biodiversity loss, but they've renamed it. And the other ones are nitrogen, the other cycles. So there's a number of things that are stressed. But to put it in more, another way of, I'm sure you've come across the Global Footprint Network and their ecological footprint that takes pretty much tries to get all the impacts, wood for paper and all the needs of people, and it converts it into a land area. And they're, in fact, it's a coincidence, isn't it? Because I just noticed that their crossover point, because they also calculate a biocapacity, which is what the world can support, which is the green line here.
And it's right at 1970.
1970, yeah. It's so that's when it was getting too close before that, I would say, but it really starts to have an impact after 1970 on wildlife, because wildlife are feeling it first, because while humans are very adaptive, and the groups that are hurt next after wildlife will be the poor, but
right, because unlike other species on the planet, we don't have to wait for a mutation to change. Animals, members of the wild kingdom, they have to wait for a mutation to change. We can, with our big brains, adapt and develop new ways to survive.
Yes, that's true. And I think because of that, it's quite because I think you were asking about if it was apocalyptic. And I think it's quite likely that the human experience of it will be a gradual degradation of welfare.
Every year gets a little worse than the one behind it. And as a friend of mine would say, in the downward spiral that is life.
Yeah, and people, I think it might be even slow enough that people won't be aware of it when they're presented with a comparison across time, or they're talking to an older person. I mean, we already know that seas and oceans have much less life in, much less variety of life. Well, particularly quantity of fish. You used to get huge, and this is being pieced together.
Off the California coast, there was an abundance in terms of the quantity of fish, the diversity of the fish, and now it's really it's down to just several species that are left in the waters off of California.
But for contemporaries, it's the new normal, and they'll get upset if that degraded condition, if they observe it getting more degraded, but they may not realize that things were much better in the past.
Right. It's interesting when I visit a place like Los Angeles that has seen so much change. And I talk to people that, let's say they've been there and they're rare, more than a few generations. When they talk about growing up in Los Angeles in the 60s and the 70s, it's almost like they're homesick. They're nostalgic for a place that they never left. And perhaps that's kind of what you're getting at.
Yes, I think that would be true for Americans and from between the 1970s and now. I mean, that wouldn't be true for humans in general, because I think it is fair what the optimists say about that human wealth around the world has increased in recent decades. In particular cases, that would be in California, perhaps that's in recent decades, that's true. But it's certainly true for wildlife. Wildlife have suffered over the last few decades.
Right, significantly. And we're looking at, for instance, like you have your physical water scarcity. All of these things that we depend on. Where I live now in Pennsylvania, it's a rural area, but you wouldn't dare drink directly out of the streams and the rivers here. All the water is polluted to some extent. Yeah,
I mean, I don't want to be too sanguine about gradual degradation. It is possible. I've come across Ugo Bardi, one of the Club of Rome Limits to Growth people, who's written on the Seneca collapse, so the idea that growth is great, but collapses in civilizations when they come are rapid. And so I don't rule that out.
It disaster. Could happen, but even Rome took 200 years. When you look at where the decline started until finally it was over in the late 400 AD, it took a long time to get there because they seemed to be able to respond. You know, there was one way or another. Diocletian was able, through inflation, raise enough money to keep the army employed and out there protecting the borders. There were always, it was, you know, crisis, you know, solution, crisis, solution, crisis, solution. But as you're saying, every year just got a little worse and a little worse.
Yeah, gradual degradation is bad enough, especially when there's no good reason for it. I mean, what's the benefit of having just more people? I mean, there are some kinds of philosophy that say that it's a good thing just to have more people, but I don't see any point in having more if it's degrading each individual's experience of life.
Absolutely. And it seems, you know, when you look at, going back to, you mentioned the Club of Rome, you know, we understood, and you look at the literature starting in the 1950s through the 1970s. I remember watching that movie Soylent Green, and there were a number of apocalyptic movies and books about population growth and what would be the result. But it seems that we've decoupled population from the environmental movement. Any thoughts on how that happened and how, frankly, we might be able to restore that?
I'll first mention, there's a good article by Professor Diana Cool of Birkbeck, London University, The Return and Disavowal of the Population Question in Environmental Politics Journal. But a primary source is a reflection by Stephen Sinding, who was one of the leaders. You know, he was involved in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s in population movement, USAID, and the population movement. And he said, he said in that there's, from the beginning, there were two strands. There were people who were concerned about the effect of over rapid growth on the whole country, and then there were people whose concern was specifically the welfare of women and children. Mm-hmm. And that first group retreated. And part of the reason they retreated, I mean, I mentioned earlier about economists are worried when it's 3% population growth.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But when it's 1%, they stop worrying.
Is that because they don't know, what they don't understand is it's algorithmic. That 1.2, that 1.3%, that means in the course of a human's lifetime, population could double.
Oh yeah, but they would say, I would think, I mean, I would describe them as cornucopian, mm-hmm. and they would say yes, but their economic system would also be growing exponentially.
Yeah, I see.
And at a faster rate. And
right, so they're able to keep up. They're able to keep people.
Yeah, this is what was what I was saying earlier, that I said a bit out of order sequence. I could. I mean, it's also because of the thing I mentioned about why fertility, the theoretical basis, because inside the discipline of demography, there's always been competing theories about why fertility declines. But it seems that outside discipline, in the development NGOs and maybe government, one theory became dominant, which is this, they saw the correlation between smaller family size and higher wealth, and there's a theory that assumes there's a one-way direction, causal link, economic development produces low fertility. Now, if you believe that theory, which is dominant in those groups, then if you believe it, then there's no point in making action on promoting smaller family size. Right. You just push the economy up, and the fertility decline should follow, if that's your theory. So that's what they do. And as I've said earlier.
But you look at, say, the case of Germany, for instance, where they actually have a negative growth rate, a slight negative, but that opens up a lot of opportunities for them. I was in Berlin 5 years ago and talking to manufacturers there. They invest a lot of money in their workers. The workers, the salaries are good. There's typically lifetime employment, if there's strong unions, and they're the most productive country in Europe. How is that? And that should tell us. And then too, I remember years ago when Merkel said they want to get rid of their nukes. Well, with a declining population, you can do that. In America, we would have a hard time with an increasing, even though albeit slow population increase, doing that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of benefits from population decline, lower rents, lower house prices, less congestion of transport. Yeah, I got a quote here from the autobiography of Karen Singh. In talking about this, this idea that maybe it's the reverse direction, that choosing a smaller family enables more investment in each child. He said, in 1974, I led the India delegation to the World Population Conference in Bucharest, where my statement that development is the best contraceptive, and you may have heard that, and that became a sort of a slogan for the development NGOs. Development is the best contraceptive. Became widely known and oft quoted. But he says, I must admit that 20 years later, I'm inclined to reverse this. And my position now is that contraception is the best development.
Absolutely.
So someone agreeing with that, the idea that you can do it the other way around.
Right. When I look at, for instance, the 1980s, you look at the countries along the Pacific Rim, who did well? Countries where birth rates were kept down, particularly in Northeast Asia. You had Japan, Korea, China, and who did poor? Who's, still when you look at per capita GDPs, the Philippines, Indonesia, places like that, where again there are larger families. That seems to be the virtue, seems to have larger families versus smaller families, because they just eat up the larger population eats up the GDP.
It's true, but I mean those places. When you mentioned Germany with slight population decline, and also South Korea, those places now, the governments of those would say, we don't want the population to decline. And this comes back to the Economist at the beginning saying that, and again, I think this is the use of, partly at least, it's about the use of the wrong measures, using, what they would say is it's about their dependency ratio. The dependency ratio, they haven't got enough people of their working age people for their older age people.
Right.
And I think that's a problem, because that's an indirect proxy measure.
But if you have fewer people, you can actually invest more in those workers, and those workers could, on an individual basis, be more productive. I'll give you
That's true.
And I was just, I'm reading Peter Frankopan's book, The Silk Roads.
I've heard of that.
And he'd commented that one of the I'm paraphrasing, but one of the benefits of the Great Plague, this reduced population size, this changed Northern Europe. It rocketed Northern Europe up, because he said the industriousness that took place, because workers were more valued, they were paid more, and they were actually able to take those wages and buy things they wanted, led to all kinds of innovations and increased productivity. He said that set the stage for the Industrial Revolution of the 1700s.
Okay. Right, yeah, I mean, definitely that sort of change enabled restructuring of the economy. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. But not really, that's not really, yeah.
And I think in India's case, where in current times, they were looking to copy the Chinese model. Unfortunately, they have so many people entering the workforce each month, they'll never be able to create enough jobs to keep people, that size of population gainfully employed. So that seems to be falling on its
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, that's the indicator you really want, is how many people are active, economically, or what proportion of people are gainfully active, economically active in the population. And
I mean, let's just say,
or even better, a ratio.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
If you've got an age-based dependency ratio, then the way you improve it is to boost the birth rate. But that just means that the population has to keep perpetually be rising, just to give you this really hard-won small improvements in your age structure and your dependency ratio.
Whereas it might mean, whereas maybe what we'll do is increase the retirement age, push it from 65 to 70. I mean, for me, a knowledge worker, the heaviest thing I'll carry is a laptop. So it's not like going to work at a car manufacturer where there's a lot of human labor, where I would be forced out of the market because of physical limitations by someone younger than myself. We can do things like that. And we've seen where governments will throw a lot of cash around, in the case of the United States, at a war or something like that. Well, maybe we'll need to put a little bit more into Social Security, but then so be it.
Yeah, yeah. And in helping, say, people over 50 who, you know, getting them back into work, and also in that a good kind of dependency ratio, including, you know, people who are contributing in other ways, as unpaid carers for grandchildren or volunteers. You know, I think there should be a different way of doing the dependency ratio. And another problem with it, like you were saying, just changing the age of retirement, because that, you know, the dependency ratio that they base it on, the cutoff is age 65. And that comes originally from a ruler in Germany in the 1870s.
Is that Bismarck?
Bismarck. It is, it's Bismarck, yeah. And so he set the retirement age at 65 for, I think it was civil service, state employees. But very few survived to that age back then. Whereas, you know, I mentioned Adair Turner, the head of was the chair of the UK Pensions Commission. There's a quote from him: "Health at any given age is increasing rapidly, and in the 1990s, this is just an example, the average French woman of 75 was as fit as a woman aged 62 was in 1900. So it's shifting. Longevity is shifting. Health at different ages is shifting, and yet the dependency ratio, the way they calculate it, which is used to inform all these political decisions, is still based on the same thing as it was 100 years ago. And it's got to change. It's just a crazy. I mean, I don't know why they do it. You know, they want to make it comparable to the data the way they calculated it for things 100 years ago. They want to be a time series to be continuous, but it's just silly. Yeah.
So that's a prescription. Are there other prescriptions that you can think of for us to better manage the size of our population?
Well, it's for governments to be proactive. I mean, this is in countries that have high birth rates, as well as making voluntary family planning universally accessible. There are examples where, when there was government programs, I mean, Kenya, back a few decades ago, had a president who was supporting a family planning program, not just making things accessible, but also, you know, actually saying, you know, it's going to be good for you. You have a smaller family, you're going to benefit. You're going to have more money to go around, and there's still, you know, that lasted for, I don't know how exactly, a decade or two, but they're still reaping the benefits from that government, that initiative back then. But it's not just governments. I don't know if you've heard of Population Media.
Oh, Bill Ryerson's group.
Well, it's the group who do soap operas.
Right, they're amazingly effective.
Radio shows and TV, yeah, which sort of puts out a message, different kinds of different messages, but about the various kinds of benefit from family planning, whether it's enabling women to stay in school longer, or because I mean that's one. Sorry, I'll finish it. Stay in school longer, or the benefits to both the husband and wife of the economics of it. But then the other, so they do good work. But,
yeah, and through that drama, they're able to teach them how to have those conversations. And all indications are that kind of non-coercive messaging works.
Oh yeah, I can, let me just find, oh, actually it was the next slide. That's good. Iran. Iran started a completely voluntary family planning program, but with that kind of message in, what does it say, in the 1980s.
Right.
And I think you can see from this graph that the total fertility rate,
brilliantly.
yeah, it just came down from 6.5 down to 2. They are now, and I think in 2015, one of the leaders of Iran decided that they'd gone far enough and they wanted to boost the fertility. So we'll see what happens in the future. But you know, it's done the job. And these kind of things, they take decades. They take time.
The consequences.
They last. Yeah, the consequences last, and hopefully once it's down, it'll stay down.
Well, I'm hoping here in the United States we can get a little wiser about population growth, and for us, considering at least 80% again is immigrant driven. That's something that we can control. It's almost like a valve we can tighten, loosen, and we just don't seem to be able to do that very well because of politics. But I'm hoping with talks like this, we might be able to educate our legislators as well as the populace at large on the benefits of smaller families.
Yes.
Well, great. Is there anything, we're getting towards the end of our hour, is there anything, John, that I've missed that you would like to share with the audience?
No, I think that's fine, thank you. Yeah.
Great. Well, John, I want to thank you again for spending some time with me here this afternoon. I think this is an important message. Again, loved your book review to Empty Planet. And I guess you're there in West Cornwall, and it sounds like a pretty nice village setting.
Yes, it is. Yeah, I was just popped up to the campus early this evening to go to a talk that was on there. Yeah, on rural, farms.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And so you're keeping your carbon footprint pretty low.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I am. Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Well, fantastic, John. Again, thanks for joining us. To our audience, if you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. And if you didn't like it, give us a thumbs down. It all works for the algorithm, gets us out there. And please subscribe to our channel, because when you subscribe, every time we put up a new video, you'll be notified. All right, John, audience, have a great day.
Thanks very much, Kevin.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.